Digging for my roots. This is my gardening project with a family tree harvest, and I'm Elizabeth Wilson Winterbone. "We are the chosen," says a quote that I came across several times while researching my family tree. In each family, there's one who seems called to find the ancestors, to put flesh on their bones and make them live again. To tell the family story is to feel that somehow they know and approve. Doing genealogy is not a cold gathering of facts, but instead it's breathing life into all who've gone before. We are the storytellers of the tribe, and it seems all tribes have one. We've been called, as it were, by our genes, and those who've gone before us cry out to us, "Tell our story." So we do. In finding them, we somehow find ourselves. I feel really honored to be able to be a witness to the people who've come before me and to tell some of that story to you. Becoming a member of the DAR has been a long-held desire of mine. The process took so much longer than I ever imagined it would, but looking back, I can see how each step could only be taken at the right time so that I would be able to take in all of the lessons and the messages that came from the past. As far back as I can remember, these photographs have hung on the wall in our family home. I knew that these old photos were named John and Elizabeth. And as a kid, that seemed silly to me because my brother and I were named John and Elizabeth. I was never really sure if they were a married couple or if they were a brother and sister too, but I knew that they were family and there was an important fact attached to them. I always knew I was eligible to join the Daughters of the American Revolution because of old John and Elizabeth. To be clear, I didn't know what the DAR was. I didn't know anyone who belonged, only that these two ancestors made me eligible. It was just a small family detail that might well have been lost and forgotten if it wasn't for the reminder of the photographs. Joining the DAR, whatever that was, sounded like a big deal in my mind as a kid, and something to look into one day. Fast forward many decades, and in 2005, I moved to Wichita and hung the photos of John and Elizabeth in my little library. My dear friend Julie, it turns out, was a member of the DAR, and she invited me to go to a meeting with her. I thought, well, now I could start to learn more about this organization. I began attending the Randolph-Loving chapter meetings, and I always enjoyed myself. I appreciated that the DAR still holds to their original goals of dedication to historical preservation, promotion of education, and encouragement of patriotic endeavor. Before long, I was introduced to Sue, registrar at the time, and she took the meager information that I had to begin the process of applying for membership. Unfortunately, I realized, having old-timey photographs is not a qualifying factor to joining the DAR. There's a lot more to it. Registrar Sue went to work with the weak family details I was able to give her, but apparently, John and Elizabeth in the photos are descendants from a soldier of the Revolutionary War, but he's not been approved by the DAR. Sadly, there isn't enough documentation to verify his service. However, Sue was able to find a recognized patriot to whom I am related, and his name was Philip Kimmel. This was big news, and I was excited to get started. Little did I know what lay ahead. The process of completing an application to join the DAR is simple. It's simple, but not easy. The national organization is very precise about the information they require to join. An applicant must provide documented proof for each relative in the line so they can verify that you are indeed a true descendant. It can be a challenge to sort out all the information that gets gathered doing research the way I did. I was interested in lots of family history, so I got off track many times. I tried to follow the advice of others who had worked on their genealogy. I had heard, start with you and what you have. But that wasn't easy for me. I didn't have much of anything to build on. For example, I didn't know my great-grandmother had a name other than Meemaw. I really think I just wasn't organized enough in my search to make any headway. I then got distracted by enrolling in grad school. But 3 years later, I was pleased to discover that during the time, a significant amount of new documentation had been digitized and was now available online. It can seem miraculous to be able to find a birth or a death certificate easily accessible on a website, but sometimes there they are, waiting to be found. Here's a will I found for my third great-grandfather and a copy of Meemaw's birth certificate. It turns out her name was Myrtle Clara. I learned so much from online resources, but they often just created more questions. I thought it would be a good idea to get all of my family photos and scrapbooks and bits of memorabilia all in one place and somewhat organized. Wow, this was emotionally exhausting work, but rewarding. One of the best perks was having email access to my great aunt in Ohio. I could snap a photo of an old image and send it to her to have her help me ID those funny-looking old folks. I did take lots of notes, but they weren't very organized. This is one chart that I made when I was working to understand different branches coming together into one small town. The visual image did help me a lot to understand the different family relationships. I learned that the website called Find a Grave is amazing for showing photos of graves from all over the United States. Through Find a Grave, I learned that a grandfather was likely buried in Ohio, but there was no photo of his headstone. This inspired me to go and visit some family landmarks in person. It was very helpful to visit cemeteries, to see old homesteads, and just get a sense of the land where they had lived. This is the headstone for my dad's mother. She is buried in a little cemetery in Dover, Ohio, near to her parents, Meemaw and Pop. And last month, my friend Julie agreed to make the trip to Springfield, Illinois with me. It turns out Springfield is a significant spot on my family tree, and I felt really lucky to get to go and see it for myself. This cemetery is in the village of Loami, which is just outside Springfield. And with Julie's help, we found 12 ancestors buried here. Online resources for genealogical research are fantastic, and they make a good holding place for information as it's gathered. I primarily used Ancestry.com to save the details. But where did all the digging lead to? Eventually, I was able to see the clear connection from me to Philip Kimmel. I became really interested in his story and how I came to be his 6th great-granddaughter. It's such an American story, you might relate to it too. This is a painting of Johann Philipp Kimmel, my ancestor, and he was born on March the 2nd, 1724, in Darmstadt, Hesse, Germany. At that time, there was a great deal of distress and upheaval in Germany. The 30 Years' War had ended and left widespread devastation. It's thought that 2/3 to 3/4 of the population died as a result of that war, and an even greater portion of their crops and cattle were destroyed. Poverty and political unrest led to desperation, and at the same time, reports were coming back from the colonies that there was good farmland available to anyone willing to work hard. William Penn was actively soliciting solid workers to come to his newly acquired Pennsylvania. So the Kimmel family were part of the wave of immigrants that left their homeland for the New World. My Kimmel ancestors lived in a small town called Gimsheim, located southwest of Frankfurt and very near the Rhine River. To travel to the colonies, I learned that the family would have traveled up the Rhine into the Netherlands and finally to Rotterdam. One record says Philip was among an extended Kimmel family group that left Gimsheim for Rotterdam on May the 22nd, 1751. This map shows the route, first sailing up the Rhine and then boarding a ship to the colonies. The ships would make a stop in Cowes in England before crossing the Atlantic. Rotterdam was a major port for traveling to the colonies in the 1750s. Between 1700 and about 1780, approximately 210,000 Europeans had reached the colonial shores. The passage to America was treacherous by any standard. The family boarded a ship called the St. Andrew that was under the command of a Scotsman by the name of Captain James Abercrombie. The passengers were then crammed into the wooden ship. There's not much doubt that the closeness of everyone made the spread of sickness rampant. Rolling and rocking at the mercy of the sea, the voyagers endured hardships unimaginable to us today. Miserable was the most common description of a journey that typically lasted 7 weeks. I read part of the diary of a schoolmaster who had made the journey a year before the Kimmels. He described the trip, saying, "During the voyage there is on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, mouth rot, and the like, all of which come from old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad and foul water, so that many die miserably." This schoolmaster actually made a trip back to Germany at some point. I can only imagine complete desperation or lack of information led to people stepping foot on one of these ships. The schoolmaster continued, saying, "Add to this want of provisions, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, anxiety, afflictions, and lamentations, together with other trouble like thick lice. The misery would reach a climax when a gale would rage for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that every one believed that the ship would go to the bottom with all human beings on board. Children aged from 1 to 7 rarely survived the voyage, and many times parents were compelled to see their children suffer and die from hunger, thirst, and sickness, and then to see them cast into the water." From his journey, the schoolmaster reported seeing 32 children dropped into the watery grave of the sea. But mercifully, the journey would end, and eventually the ship arrived in Philadelphia Harbor. Philadelphia was a major arrival point for German immigrants during this time. It may seem an unlikely port of entry, but 1.3 million immigrants passed through this port. During the 1700s, there was an influx of German and Scots-Irish immigrants. Once a ship arrived, no one was permitted to leave except those who had paid for their passage. The others who could not pay had to remain on board until they were purchased and released from the ships. They were known as redemptioners. Every day, locals would come to the port looking for workers, and they would board the ships and negotiate directly with passengers for work in exchange for paying for their fare. They would typically have to agree to serve 3 to 6 years if they were healthy. The sick always fared the worst and sometimes would languish on board for 2 or 3 more weeks and sometimes die without ever stepping foot in America. Meanwhile, those families that could afford to pay their passage were able to disembark, but first the heads of the family would go to the courthouse where they would swear allegiance to the British king. Once in the courthouse, the passengers would line up and they would sign their names. Shown here is a list of travelers that had arrived in Philadelphia. The heading on this manifest says, "At the Courthouse of Philadelphia, Saturday, the 14th of September, 1751, present the Worshipful Mayor Joshua Maddox, Esquire. The foreigners whose names are underwritten, imported in the ship of St. Andrew, Captain James Abercrombie, from Rotterdam, but last from Cowes in England, did this day take and subscribe the usual qualifications." This document was an extremely exciting discovery. This very manifest is for the arrival of the St. Andrew that brought the Kimmel family to America. 2/3 of the way down the column on the left, you can see the signature of Johann Philipp Kimmel. And here's a closer look. His brother Jacob's name is just above, and a family member named Adam Kimmel is just below. I got a thrill when I found this oil painting. It's called "The Landing of the Schwenkenfelders" from the St. Andrew. This is a great image of early immigrants arriving on the very same ship my family traveled on. Upon landing in Philadelphia, some of the Kimmel family went to Lancaster County, but Philip's brother had been granted a parcel of land from the sons of William Penn. So Philip Kimmel and other family members actually settled in York County for a time. Philip was 27 years old when he arrived in Pennsylvania. A few years later, he married a girl named Anna Henn. Later, Philip moved his family to Bedford County, and it's here that in 1781 he was described as Philip Kimball, tax collector for Quemahoning Township. It's not a romantic service like being a fife player or a famous general, but being a tax collector was important for the success of the Revolution. The National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution accepted Philip as a patriot for his service as a tax collector for the Continental Congress. Philip lived near Stony Creek Township in Somerset County until his death in 1796, aged 72. Philip's family eventually moved west across America over the next 165 years. His son David moved across Pennsylvania, and then in 1817 he loaded his household on a flatboat in Pittsburgh, sailed down the Ohio River, where they eventually settled just outside Dayton, Ohio. One generation later, members of the John Kimmel family made the move west to Springfield, Illinois. Good farming and cheap land seemed to be the motivation for these moves, as they were all farmers. But my great-grandfather broke the pattern, moved his young family into town, and had a job in construction. My grandfather was a teenager when they left Illinois and moved to Des Moines. And it was in Des Moines where my mom spent most of her childhood. Helen was born in 1926 to Bernice and Harley Kimmel. She was raised by her mother after her parents' divorce. Her mother remarried when Helen was 13 and the family moved to Detroit, Michigan. Mom was a lively, fun person that loved Girl Scouting and sports and having a good time. After graduating from high school, she attended college in Ohio, and it was in college that this happened. Mom met my dad at Heidelberg College in Tiffin, Ohio. And my dad was born in Cadiz, Ohio in 1926. He spent most of his childhood in Dover, Ohio, surrounded by a loving family, including 5 doting aunts. He was the captain of the high school football team, and he went on to play for Heidelberg College, and a big surprise to me was that he played one semester at KU and lettered in football. so I guess our family are Jayhawk fans after all. He joined the Navy and served briefly before the war ended. He loved the outdoors and learning about the Civil War and visiting historic sites. Ben and Helen were married after graduation in August of 1948. Ben was an Ohio boy and a football star, so living in Ohio was a natural fit. They settled in a little post-war tar paper house in Tiffin, Ohio. Ben went to work as a coach. To start, he coached football and track and any other sport that needed a coach. And Helen continued organizing Girl Scout camps and troops. They moved every few years as Ben's coaching star was on the rise. They had longed for children, so after being married for 7 years, in 1954 they adopted an infant boy they named John. And 6 years later, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Ta-da! I was born in Sandusky, Ohio in April of 1960. So here we are at the base of my family tree. I do have some significant discoveries that I've made along the way that I want to share, but before that I thought I would share a bit of my personal story too. When I was born in Sandusky, my mom was a Girl Scout leader and Dad was a high school football coach. In the summer, he was a lifeguard at Cedar Point. And my older brother, he was in kindergarten. I hear I made a great show and tell subject for him. Some of my earliest memories are sitting in the football stands and hearing my mom cheer for the team. I have very happy childhood memories of swimming and road trips and playing dress up. And I had fun birthday parties, and naturally I joined the Girl Scouts. In 1968, we moved from Charlottesville, Virginia, when my dad was hired to be head coach for the Wichita State University football team. When I was 10 years old, my brother and I lost both of our parents in the WSU plane crash of 1970. We both went to live in Maryland with some distant relatives, and it was a very traumatic time. Looking back now, I can see how I was completely torn up by the roots. I know many people experience similar traumas in their lives. It impacts us in so many seen and unseen ways. But for me, the sense of being untethered and ungrounded followed me for decades. For a brief time as a teenager, I did come back to live in Wichita. And then my guardianship was changed, and I moved to Los Angeles at age 13 to live with my newly married uncle. Everyone did the best that they could, but it's no easy task to take in an unhappy teenager. A number of years later, I went on a cruise with my grandmother and met an English officer named Jonathan Winterbone. We were married in Suffolk, England in 1980 and settled in Billericay, Essex. Our son Oliver was born in 1982, and Philip arrived 4 years later. I loved being a mom. It gave me an opportunity to give and to live what I had longed for as a child. After 12 years of living in England, John was transferred to New Jersey. Oliver was 10 at the time and Philip was 6. We came back and it felt strange to live in America again. I had a completely different appreciation for being an American citizen. We lived in New Jersey for 14 years and eventually came to the realization that we had grown apart as a couple. So, in a roundabout way, I came back to Wichita. It has proven to be very healing to return to the place where I was first uprooted and little by little feel my way into wholeness. I've put down my own roots. I slowly learned to trust myself and know I always have my own back. I know I can stand on my own 2 feet, and I feel confident that I will always be okay. Part of diving into your family history is making discoveries which can include learning about heartbreak, as well as simple family joys. One of the best things to have happened on my journey was to reconnect with my dad's cousin Anne. She grew up with him in Ohio and has been able to really help me to know him as a young person. I also learned that my mom taught Anne how to knit. Now, she's a beautifully accomplished knitter and has made me wonderful socks that feel like love when I put them on. Another discovery while going through all my family boxes was to realize I come from a family of Valentine senders. I found so many Valentines, some sent to grown children and parents and to cousins and grandparents. I love getting to read the sentiments. They're so dear and charming. I soaked up the old-fashioned sending of love and best wishes and how they had valued them enough to keep them. The card on the left is a poignant one. It's one from my dad to his mother. His handwritten note says, "Dear Mom, hope you don't think I've forgotten you. I'm off to Wichita tomorrow. It promises to be a big adventure. Love, Ben." But I also got a better understanding of some of the mysterious and unspoken parts of the family. Two people that were complete mysteries to me before starting this project were my grandfathers. Truly, I knew only their names when I started. So here is some of what I've learned. My mom's father was Harley Roscoe Kimmel. He had lived in Springfield until he was a teen and the family moved to Des Moines, Iowa. He and Bernice Bramhall, my grandmother, went to the same high school, and then they both attended Drake University. This was the very first photograph I'd ever seen of my grandfather. I found it last year on ancestry.com in a yearbook that had been scanned. And this is my grandmother from her college years. They married on Thanksgiving Day after graduation. But within a few years, the marriage sadly failed. By 1930, with two little children, my grandmother Bernice was living as the head of the household, and Harley had moved on and eventually lost touch with his children. After my grandparents divorced, I don't think my mom ever saw her dad again, although I have found a letter he wrote to her when she was in college. He sounds cautious, but keen to form a relationship with her. He had remarried and had 3 more children. Harley worked as an executive for Sears Roebuck. He loved the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he owned a home designed by him for a time. His health was poor, and he died aged 54 in Atlanta. His daughter had died, but he has 2 sons, my mom's half-brothers, still living. I've been in contact with both of them, and we have a sweet, kind of curious online relationship. My new half-uncle, Nick, kindly sent me this photo of Harley, and I was able to share the letter with him. My other mysterious grandfather was J. Roseberry. My dad grew up in Ohio, and it does not seem insignificant that his parents also divorced when he was very young. Family lore says Jay was charming and likable, but couldn't keep a job. He was also gone from the family when my dad was 3 or 4, and I don't believe he ever saw his father again. Up until a few years ago, I only knew his name, and that my dad legally changed his name to Ben Wilson when he was a young man. I spent many hours trying to find any information about Jay. One day, while looking on Ancestry.com, I saw a mention of a marriage in West Virginia of a J. Roseberry and Esther Wilson, and it turned out it was my grandparents, and that was the first real clue. I did eventually piece together a little story of Jay. He had been married before, and his wife had died. He married my grandma, and it seems he just couldn't make money to provide for the family. So when my dad was a little boy, he went to live with Pop and Meemaw, and my grandmother went to work for Western Union, and Jay disappeared. These are the only photos I have of him, one with my dad and one with my grandma. I tracked down mention of him being buried in Ohio in the same cemetery as his first wife, So when I went to Ohio last fall, I tried to find him. Jay had died in his 70s of alcoholism, but he'd worked as a garage hand for many years. The old cemetery was very quiet the Sunday afternoon I visited. There were no workers around, so I walked all over, just trying to find his grave. I did find the grave of his first wife, but I couldn't find him. I left feeling so frustrated. It seems Jay had been elusive in life and then elusive in death. I did call and I left a message on the office phone number and was surprised to get a call back. Yes, the man said Jay was buried there, but with no marker. And he offered to put up cones for me, so I went back the next day. Jay never knew he had a granddaughter. He died before I was born. But I stood on the grave as the marker. I'm the visible proof that this man existed and that someone was looking for him. Of all the people that I came to know during my research, the one who became the most vivid was my dad's mother, Esther. My grandma's story is very poignant and has great sadness. There are lots of details I could share, but to keep it short, after she was divorced and working in another town, she fell in love with a married man and ended up having a baby girl. The little girl, named Barbara, died of an infection when she was a toddler. My dad never knew he had a sister. I guess there was a great deal of family shame surrounding this child. But my dad's cousin Anne remembers her. We've worked together, and I think I found where little Barbara is buried. I've ordered the death certificate for confirmation, and I'm still waiting. I want to bring Barbara back into the family. Learning about Barbara and studying my grandma's life has given me such a deep sense of compassion for her. Like many women of her era, she had little dominion over her life, and there was a wistfulness about her that I never completely understood until recently. Because of this genealogy project, I've come to know my grandma so much better, even though she's been gone for 30 years. I've loved exploring the branches of my family tree. I've made connections with family members that I had completely lost contact with, and other family relationships have been strengthened. The branches and roots now spread wide on my tree. Working with my DAR sisters, I've formed friendships that truly are the flowers in my garden. And I'm hoping that one day my little granddaughters will find the DAR as fulfilling as I do. This family history is personal to me, of course, and I have edited the story to fit for this presentation. But I'm so happy to realize my life, my very being, is much too expansive for a presentation. But now comes the fun part for me. I've enjoyed diving into DAR training programs, and I'm already starting to look for supplemental patriots. After applying, it takes months to hear from DAR National. It was so exciting to get the verification from my regent last December. At last, I was official. I'm so proud to be a member of the DAR. I could not wait to order my insignia. After all these years, having the ribbon and the pins lets me outwardly show how I really feel. I belong. Thanks for listening.